So, ladies and gentlemen, this is young fellow's second time being with us at our festival. He graced us a few years ago, came and did a wonderful talk about St. Louis ragtime and jazz contributions in particular, and of course played marvelously. He's going to be doing all that this weekend. Right now it's time for our young friend from St. Louis, Missouri, T.J. Muller, to take center stage. Center stage.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Jeff. It's really great to be here. I'm really glad to be afforded the opportunity to do a talk. I do like to talk. So yeah, last time I was here, I did a talk on. I think I did St. Louis around about the time of the World's Fair, and we looked at historic St. Louis jazz, ragtime. And there are several talks I do around town in St. Louis. I talk for different clubs and societies. And usually I talk about St. Louis music history specifically. And my main focus is the 1920s in St. Louis. So I do a lot of talk about what riverboat jazz was like and the different types of music you could expect to hear around St. Louis. The fanciest show I do is I do that lecture with my orchestra, and we play all the music. But when asked to do a talk this year, I wanted to think of something new to do. I found some new software to make new fancy-looking slides, and I wanted a chance to try something out. And so I thought, well, what's different? What haven't people perhaps heard before? And I realized that throughout the course of this weekend, you're going to hear some wonderful music, and you might ask a question, which I've had asked from audience members many times. Well, how did you get into this type of music? And how did you learn to play in this old way? Well, it doesn't just happen. You can't. 100 years ago, when this music was popular, it was all around. You didn't have to think about learning it. You just immersed in the culture. But this music isn't really a part of your everyday culture. You're not going to hear Jelly Roll Morton, unless you're very lucky, being played at your local grocery store. And so I thought it might be interesting, I hope, to discuss with you exactly how we preserve early styles of American music of the 20th century, specifically today, and why. Why do we do it, and what role does that play in the modern world? Is it simply anachronistic, or is there a function? Is there a reason? And so we'll explore that. I've not done this lecture before, and so it could take 15 minutes. It could take an hour. We'll see. And so please do think of questions, because we may need them for me to get my paycheck at the end of this. But at the very least, it's a very nice looking presentation. Okay. So to start off with, and some of this was covered already, I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction on who I am and how I came into playing this type of music. Because everything I talk about from this point onwards is only from my own experience. And if you talk to, I'm a young, well, less and less so, but I'm still a young man from the UK. My experience of learning this music is entirely different to Louis Ford's, who grew up in New Orleans, to Jeff, who grew up kind of at the heights of the Dixieland Festival era, really. All of our experiences are different.
Thank you for saying I grew up.
A young man says to his dad, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a musician." And the dad says, "Son, you can't do both." Okay. So, I've been listening to old jazz music literally my whole life. That cute as a button young man there playing the harmonica is me. Just a couple of years ago there. And actually, now my 2-year-old daughter is paying me back because she's discovered the harmonica, and it is the most annoying and cute thing in the world. But that's me a little over there. But born into a musical family, we had two types of music growing up. We had bad Christian worship music, not just bad. Yeah. Fake Paul Simon songs, you know. And we had Dixieland jazz. So I became fascinated with Dixieland jazz. And my uncle had a fairly successful novelty Dixieland band in the 1980s called the Froggets. They played for the royal family, and I had their CDs and was so excited to play them, knowing that my family had made them. And we had a family band that played absolute basic traditional jazz standards. My dad taught me how to play 5/2 Eyes of Blue, an abridged version that just used 2 notes. We used to play for church events, and my dad called the band the Glenn Muller Band, which still sends shivers down my spine. As a young teen, I don't know, about the age of 12 or 13, my mum knew I learned ukulele. I was interested in George Formby, who was an old musical star from the UK. And so my mum found the only local jug band, Mrs. Knox and the Good Time Boys. This is when you could still smoke in bars. So she took me as a little kid to a smoky bar, and these old musicians who've been playing since the big jug band revival that the Beatles came out of. These were all Northern English folks with mutton chops, a wash tub bass, smoking cigars and pipes, playing mandolins and playing the old Americana tunes, old blues songs. And anyway, I was fascinated by them. They let me join the band kind of on an apprenticeship. Actually, I played harmonica with them at first. And through them, I got my first really professional working gigs around the north of England, playing in pubs. I made $20 each show, which was a fortune for me at that age. And I learned songs which I still use today, actually. Leadbelly songs, all those many songs that were written right around here, actually. So anyway, I'll skip forward a bit. I went to college unsuccessfully. I dropped out to join a Dixieland band. That's the Dixieland band there. And you can see actually we did a photo shoot for the Edinburgh Jazz Festival, and that's me sitting on a cannon. Probably many people probably wish they could strap their banjo player to a cannon. That's us in Edinburgh. Through that band, I met Pokey LaFarge, who was an Americana songwriter from St. Louis, Missouri. He auditioned me on the trumpet. I showed up in the USA, just turned 21, with a suitcase in one hand and a trumpet in the other. In fact, you see that picture of me looking about 50 pounds skinnier in the brown suit? Somebody took that on my way to the airport, just a random photographer. I found it online years later. But that's me on my way to my audition. And I got the job, and I toured the world. We played all sorts of amazing things for David Letterman's show, Prairie Home Companion. We did a documentary for Robert Redford on early American jazz, and I did my contract, met my fantastic wife. She said, stop touring, so I stopped touring. She didn't say, she was happy to touring, but I chose to leave. I started a radio show in St. Louis on KDHX, which aired weekly. I'm actually moving soon, if it all goes ahead, to the classical music station, so hopefully I'll get a higher caliber of listener. And in St. Louis, I met the St. Louis Ragtimers, who are an incredibly important band in the mid-century revival of ragtime music. And to this day, I still work with Bill Mason, who I'll talk about later in the lecture, who just turned 95, and he's my absolute hero and a good friend. So that's a little background on how I got into this music and how I came to be here right now. And it kind of matters, but it used up 5 minutes, didn't it? See? So here we go. So we're going to talk about now the next several slides about how we pass this music down, how we learn it, and one of the most important things for me is going to be oral traditionalist music. That means music passed down, not just music, but stories and ideas passed down from one person to another. Not necessarily written, not necessarily published, but the stuff you can only learn in person. And it requires getting out of the house and getting off of YouTube, actually, and going and meeting people, making connections and friendships. It's the idea that we also call stewardship. My starting points for for learning these tunes. As I mentioned, it was my family. And I think what was the first song that I was taught in the traditional jazz canon that I learned this way, and it was, I think it was my mum singing Babyface, back when I had a baby face, not a lovely face, which he now sings to me. It was like that. It was like my dad teaching me 5'2", Mrs. Knox and the Good Time Boys, the jug band, learning the tunes from them in person. So that is one important way in which we can learn this material. Another way, fundamental way in which I began learning this music, and this is a common experience with traditional jazz musicians, is you seek mentorship. You seek a mentor. When I lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, I had been primarily a cornetist, but as I mentioned, I learned some ukulele and banjo, but I wanted to learn how to play jazz banjo, so I looked it up in the, I can't remember how I found him. I found a man called Rob McKillop. He's still around and he's fantastic, and he plays every historic type of string instrument from the lute to the tenor banjo, plectrum banjo, 5-string banjo, and I did a short course of him on plectrum banjo, and he taught me the fundamentals of the instrument. Just enough so that when I came to the US, I was able to join the St. Louis Banjo Club. You can see that right here. These informal clubs and societies, that's one way that amateur musicians begin to learn what we call the canon of material. Ukulele clubs, banjo clubs. It was by learning the 4-string banjo, attending banjo club, that I began to learn what I considered to be a suitable professional amount of material. And the banjo club have this wonderful thing where they have an alphabetical book of about 1,000 songs, and they meet twice a month. And on the first meeting in January, they start with Abba Dabba Honeymoon. And when they play it, 3 choruses, 1 trombone, the banjo, 1 vocal, then banjo's out. That's it. For 60 years, twice a month. and then they move on to the next song. By the end of the year, you're back at Abba Dabba Honeymoon. and I got good enough that they allowed me to lead the sessions a few times. Clubs like this are a common experience for aspiring professional musicians. Let's listen to a St. Louis Banjo Club. If you've never heard a banjo band, this will keep you up at night. Oops. But it's a good time. It's monstrous, but it's fun. Oops, pardon me. Well, that's not okay.
That's it.
That's what we're going to listen to about. One of my most important experiences, though, in St. Louis was seeking the mentorship of Bill Mason, Wild Bill Mason from the St. Louis Ragtimers. Let me take this for a second. So I sort of jumped back to mentorship here, but there is a slight difference between, it's not just about seeking mentorship, it's find the oldest, best musician you can, wherever you are. That would be my advice to a young, aspiring traditional jazz musician. And for me, that was Wild Bill Mason, right here. He's played jazz music in St. Louis within 8 separate decades. He started in the 1940s. Now, Bill was playing jazz gigs at the time of segregation, where he was the only white musician on stage. And just as I sought out Bill sought out the musicians that came before him. And he wound up playing with riverboat musicians, ex-riverboat musicians in St. Louis, who had played alongside Louis Armstrong in the early 1920s, who had played alongside King Oliver. He got their stories and in turn was able to pass down this knowledge and history to me. And that is a crucial part of our world and the music we do. So I just want to play you an excerpt of Bill Mason playing with these fantastic African-American musicians who, this is when Bill was my age, this was in 1957, and he's playing with members of Fate Marable's band, who had been playing with Louis Armstrong in the 20s. So this is Bill playing Mahogany Hall Stomp in 1957. The gentleman playing trombone on this record is actually another white musician who was 16 at the time, called Kid Hasty, who I got to meet and work with before he passed away as well. And just because this is awesome, this is Bill in 2023 playing some ragtime with me and some New Orleans musicians. This is Bill at 94 years old, still playing great trumpets. If any of you want to have the full tracks of his music and to enjoy later, I'll happily send you a link with all of the music. And so finally, oh yeah, this is Bill in the 1950s. Glenn Meyer here is a clarinetist who's still alive, also and working in St. Louis. And in fact, I got funding to do a monthly gig with these guys. And literally, I drive around their retirement homes and pick them up. And we play at a restaurant called Evangeline's that sells New Orleans food. And once a month, it's me and a bunch of 80 to 95-year-old musicians. And they love it. And the most important thing is that it keeps them working professional musicians like they have been their whole life. It's a way for them to continue playing with dignity. And that's incredibly important in our tradition. Yeah. Moving on, this is a little sad for me. This gentleman here is called Charles Kreff III, and he became a friend. I met him playing in the bar next to the club that I was playing at, and somebody said, you know, Charles is playing next door. And I said, Charles who? And he said, well, Charles Kreff. And to me, that name is very important because Charles Kreff I was one of my favorite recording African-American musicians from St. Louis in the 1920s. He was a big deal as a blues and jazz cornetist and band leader. And I got to know his grandson. And initially through my enthusiasm for his family history. And we would play a bit together. He was one of the last recording pianists and organists for Motown Records, actually, Charles III. And so our styles were very different, but we loved playing together because of the sort of mutual respect. But Charles also, and this I guess part of the oral tradition, is he told me amazing stories about his grandfather that you could only learn by going and seeking members of the family. Stories that haven't been published, just to pass down from generation to generation. So I was very lucky to get to meet him. I'm gonna move on from this slide, I think. I do have sound clips of both generations, but I'll save them for now. If we have time at the end, I'll play them. Okay, so next up, how we learn this type of music. Find my correct page here. Literature. Now this stuff can be hard to find because a lot of this material isn't being republished. But the one way we go out and learn these old styles, these early 20th century styles of performing and playing, are through old texts. I want to start by talking about method books. Method books are still available today. But any of you who've learned to play an instrument probably remember, you know, getting a book that starts off with I don't know, some nursery rhyme, Little Brown Jug or something, but ends with something marginally more difficult, and lots of boring exercises in between. Well, they've been making them forever, but they can be enlightening because they do change over time. It's not the same exercises, and the different techniques that are highlighted in method books from different eras tell you about the musical priorities of that instrument in the time that book was published. And so here we have a book I've been studying recently, the Nick Lucas plectrum guitar method. Nick Lucas was one of the most prominent guitarists of his day in the early 1920s. In fact, Gibson guitars still make a Nick Lucas flat top guitar. It's still one of the most popular flat top designs, even though his name isn't really remembered today. Well, in his method book, it is all chord-based soloing and a sort of boom chuck, a style which just isn't used in jazz today. But if you study his book, you will learn how to play early 1920s rhythm guitar. It's all written down along with tips. But if you were to find a method book from 1939, it would be entirely different. Same for 1960 and so on. So method books are very, very useful. They may range in books for beginners to books for advanced musicians who want to learn more about technique. Jeff, you probably come across these novelty piano instructional books, the Axel Christian books. There were books published for professional musicians who were perhaps classical that wanted to learn how to play jazz. And they're full to the brim of novelty breaks and choruses and solos. And if you can find them, they're a wonderful, wonderful resource, and I found them very useful. These two images here come from a book by a guy who was making jazz instructional books in the early 1920s called Louis Panico. He was a cornetist. And what's significant about this is that he firsthand witnessed King Oliver's band play. King Oliver was Louis Armstrong's mentor and was one of the most important early practitioners of jazz. And there are sounds that he accomplished using mutes on the trumpet, which Louis Panico witnessed firsthand and documented in his book. And here he is in the early 1920s publishing exactly how to achieve those sounds. So I found them incredibly useful. Let's see here. One other fun thing about method books is they offer little tips like this. In ensemble playing, this is from a banjo book, sit near drums and piano. Useful professional stuff. The same guy, this guy has all sorts of sassy stuff as well. He's like, when playing a banjo solo, keep your mouth closed. No one wants to see you dribbling on your instruments. And there's all sorts of great stuff like that. It's really, he's really catty. It's from Charles McNeil's banjo method book. He was Isham Jones's banjo player. Another interesting thing he says in his book from the mid-1920s is that go listen to bands, and if you can't listen to bands, buy records and listen to records. And so we'll talk about that actually in a bit. It goes without saying, but one way you learn old music is by reading old music. Find the sheet music. It seems like the most obvious thing in the world, but you'll be surprised how many musicians we talk to that say, oh, I tried learning this tune and I couldn't find a good version on YouTube. So, get the music, just read it. It's right there. I'm trying to learn all of me and just read it. You can see I'm a frustrated band leader.
You're speaking gospel, young man. You're speaking gospel.
But one step further than that, how we learn about the way early jazz bands functioned in the 1920s is not just by getting the piano sheet music, which can teach us also about harmonies and chord progressions, but by finding the original published orchestrations. So it's something that we call stock arrangements. Here's an example of a stock arrangement. Any idiot with a few dollars and a few friends that played instruments could go buy a stock arrangement and start his own orchestra, which is exactly, I am the exact sort of idiot that did that. I bought some stock arrangements and started an orchestra. And you put them in front of the band, and if they play it correctly, it will sound like good 1920s jazz. Now that was useful back in the day for starting a band, it's useful today for starting a band, but it's also useful today because you can study them and you can learn just sort of through reverse engineering how to create 1920s jazz. If you study the function of each instrument, how they're harmonized, because the way three saxophones are harmonized in 1920, let's say 24, is different to how the reeds are harmonized in 1917 if you study an arrangement. And I've done this. If you look at an arrangement from 1917, so many of the horns are actually doubling the melody. It had a different function then. The priority in the 19-teens in the bands was so often clarity. That's why you have guys like Al Jolson who are so popular. To our ears today, they sound a bit harsh, but they're clear. enunciate, and it's why pianos, historically older pianos, are brighter, because people favoured clarity. And so early arrangements, there's lots of doubling of the melody because that's the priority. In the mid-1920s, stuff is very tightly and closely harmonized because the musical priority started to shift. People wanted not only hot dancehall music, but music that seemed pretty, a lot more akin to how we consider close vocal harmonies to be. That's how people wanted to hear their horns. Now you jump ahead to and study a stock arrangement from 1940 or 41, and all of a sudden, it's almost like going back to the ragtime thing. First of all, there's far more horns, so every harmony is covered. So there's more harmony than you get in the ragtime arrangements. But there's so many horns that all of a sudden, you can have lots more people dubbing the melody again. And also, you now get it in octaves. So it's that big band sound, it's that big, bold sound, which, again, when you think of like 40s big band music, the musical priority is also that big sound, that big, full driving sound. So that's one way you can study stock arrangements to learn about practicing old styles of jazz. And the most popular arrangers of the day also wrote method books on how to arrange for orchestras, and I've hunted down as many as I can with the help of Vince Giordano. This is my favorite thing, though, I've ever found in a stock arrangement. This is in the first trumpet part for Crazy Quilt, and it's at the trumpet solo, and if you can't read it, it says obbligato. If you're drunk, you can't play this. I know. That's in the trumpet part for a published arrangement. And finally, and this now is jumping back to the storytelling tradition. We study the words of the musicians of the time, not only to learn about the world they lived in, to better understand their music, but also the books they wrote are full of treasure, just full of absolute treasure. The Baby Dodds story. It's a book all the drummer Baby Dodds. He worked with Louis Armstrong, so many people. In his book, he literally talks about how he tunes his drums, the technique he uses to play his drums, and how that changed over time. The book next to it is Garvin Bushell's book. Now, Garvin Bushell is a guy who started playing ragtime in the 19-teens and wound up playing classical music in California in the 1950s and 60s. He saw it all, and he describes how the music changed over time. So these are absolutely tremendously valuable resources. One of my favorite stories from one of these method books, and this is funny, it's from a New Orleans, sorry, not method books, autobiographies. It's a New Orleans musician describing playing marching bands in the ragtime era. And his one advice to future musicians is that always play music on a full belly of gumbo. He says, don't fill up on alcohol, fill up on gumbo, and you'll have enough strength in your stomach to play those high notes. So here we go, I'm going to press on here. Now, this is a terribly important way that we study. I'm just going to do a time check. What time do I have until, Jeff? Like 20 past or something?
Let's see. I think, yeah, 20 past.
Okay, I'm doing pretty well. I don't mean in terms of content, I just mean in terms of time. So one way that we learn to play this sort of music is just by listening to the records. It's that simple. But first things first, you have to learn how to listen to 78 records. Some of you out there might have grown up in a family that played old records, and you might take this for granted. But first of all, listening to mono, we're not used to mono anymore. We're used to stereo. So listening to mono can sound unusual to modern listeners. I remember the first record I bought, it might have been a tape cassette actually, but it was a best of Louis Armstrong thing, and it started with his early recordings and went to his late recordings. And I remember as a child, I couldn't listen to the really old stuff. It didn't make sense. It sounded distorted. I couldn't make out what instrument was what, and so I'd always skip to like the 1930s recordings. It wasn't until I was in my sort of later teens that I went and said, no, there's good stuff here. And I remember having to teach my ear how to understand what I was hearing. And it's almost like becoming fluent in a language. If you hear, say you don't speak Italian, and you hear somebody speaking Italian, it doesn't, you're not identifying what they're saying, you're not identifying the context or words. But if you're fluent in a language, everything's being translated instantly. And that's how it is with old records. You know the trumpet player is using a straight mute or a cut mute. You know the drummer is using a mallet or a stick. Because your brain has learnt to identify tones which have been put through a certain filter. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so that's step number one. And then step number two is that you can't just say, listen to old records and learn old jazz. Because jazz is 100 different things, even in a 2-year span in the 1920s. It was changing all the time. Just think that in 1900, the most popular recording artist was probably John Philip Sousa or something. And then just in a 30-year span, you're getting blues shout singers. You're getting electric guitar in 30 years. That's a huge change. Imagine, like, music hasn't changed that much since 1995 to now. So it's a tremendous change in music just within one genre alone. So what you have to do when you listen to old records, to really understand the era and to focus in on your stylistic choices as somebody trying to play this music, is you have to constantly compare and contrast. And so this is what we're going to do, just as an example of this. We're going to listen to the song Tiger Rag. And firstly, we're going to listen to an old version, 1917, the first recorded version, to my knowledge. And we'll get as far as 1935. And we will, and I'm going to ask you to do what we do as musicians studying this old music. Just listen and notice the differences. See how things change and see what things remain the same. This is what we're looking for when we learn how to play old styles. So let's start off with the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. This is a band from New Orleans. And let's take a listen. We'll just listen to about 10, 15 seconds. Acoustically recorded. Okay, let's jump ahead. This is Big Spiderbeck with the Wolverines in 1924. What's different, what's the same? I'll tell you one thing that's the same, is that it's still acoustically recorded. Do you know what I mean by that? It's recorded into a big horn. There's probably some around here somewhere. You stick your head in the horn and you sing, and literally the vibrations make the record, just like a string on a tin can. It's still the same technology. Listen, what's the same stylistically and what's different? You don't have to say it aloud. It is different, isn't it? For one thing, it's harmonized. Before, it was what we call polyphony, 3 separate lines. Now it's one harmonized line, weaving around. It's also more abstract. The melody is more abstract. Okay, let's jump to 1929. Now we're electrically recorded. This is maybe using a microphone, still to 78. Even more abstract. Okay, let's jump to 1935.
Who was that in 29?
That was Arthur Talley and his orchestra. And I'll explain the differences in a second. Okay, there you go, a very Louis Armstrong inspired version from 1935 by Nat Ganella. And so, I don't think I need to get into the differences between them. I think you can see my point here. You can see that by studying these different records, we learn a lot about how music is changing and how it varies, and what we need to focus our attention on if we want to perform it in a manner true to the style you've been asked to. Now this comes in useful when I've got some limited experience doing TV and movie stuff, and sometimes you're asked to say, hey, this is set in 1920 whatever, can you do it? And you say, yes, we can do it perfectly authentically. And then they say, can you make it jazzier? So, so this is another important distinction though. It's geography. If you really want to learn this music to the degree that I tried to, this band's from New Orleans, but they went to Chicago and then recorded in New York. Does it matter? Maybe. It's up to you to figure that out. This band, Dixon Davenport, this is a Midwestern band, also going to New York to record as well, but they also recorded in Richmond, Indiana. Midwestern musicians, pretty much. But this is British. This is British dance band. And so is this guy. And so we study records from different geographical areas of the same era, and we think about those differences. And so that's how we use records to figure out how these old styles are performed. Another thing we do with records is we painstakingly listen to them over and over again, and this is the software I use. We write out note for note what we're hearing, and this is one way that you can recreate old jazz, because nobody in my band cares as much as I do about these differences. So it's easier sometimes if I just hand them written music and tell them how to play. So I'll listen to a record, I'll transcribe it onto my computer, and then I'll give it to my band. And I want to give you an example of how this works. So here we go. Here's the original recording of a St. Louis record. This is 1924, Gene Rodemick playing Tijuana, the original 78. Okay, moving on. This is the awful MIDI file version. Oops, let's go back. This is the awful. It's horrible. This is my computer playing it after I entered all the notes. It's unlistenable. There you go. I entered it all in note for note, listened really carefully, and wrote down everything I heard. And then I gave it to my band. We're back in 1924. And so that's how we use transcribing to recreate. That's how we use transcribing to recreate old styles of music. None of those people in that band are specialist 1920s musicians, but it's possible to bring this music back to life through these techniques. Okay, I'm getting the feeling I'm talking too much, which is my nature, so I'll be brief because I want to leave a little time for questions. And actually, this slide can be incredibly brief, but community is fundamental to what we do. Community is, for this music to exist in the modern day, you need a community of not only people that love to perform it, but people like yourselves who love to listen to it. It's vital, otherwise what's the point? And making these connections, this gentleman here, you might recognize, Jeff turns around and faces the wall. There you go, that's Jeff.
There he is. Wait, I even have the hat.
That's his better side.
There you go, he's got the exact same hat. There you go. Making the effort to get together, to meet up, to share the stories that we've learned, to share the songs we've learned, to share our different ideas about the songs. Two of us might love the same musician and have fiercely different ideas about how his music should be or her music should be performed. It's all part of the process of preserving, is making sure that we do what we can to keep the community alive and to strengthen it. And so this is just a bunch of people that I love playing with from around the USA mostly. No Brits on the screen except for me.
Well, TJ, it's also about support of one another in our quest to keep the music going.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes us great.
It's vital. It's absolutely vital. Okay, so we'll move on from that. Okay, this is something which is one way in which we, as practitioners of music, test ourselves. Are we playing it right? And how can we figure, we can't time travel. We can't go and play our band next to the original band. We only have the records for that. But one thing that we can do is be creative with the way that we experiment with old music. And what we can do is reverse engineering. We can take an old record that we like and want to try and figure out how did that band sound in person. And this is a band recording acoustically. You see into those megaphones. We can take that same technology. We can take an acoustic 78 lathe with a recording horn. We can take the original record, listen to it, transcribe it, learn it, and try and play it how we think it was originally played, and then record it the way they did, and then listen back to back. Does it sound the same? If not, what do we need to change? Are we articulating too soft? Are we articulating too hard? Are we rushing? Are we, is the band sounding balanced like the original record? So these are two recordings that we made in January of this year. Actually, I think both recordings were made literally 100 years to the month that the original recordings were made, January of 2024, in St. Louis, Missouri. And so here's two examples. You can see Josh Duffy there playing a suitcase. So the first thing I'll play for you is a record of a St. Louis novelty band called the Mound City Blue Blowers. They play banjo, kazoo, all those instruments. And here's the original recording. Kazoo, cone, banjo. Okay, here's our version, and we play it too fast. That's what I learned. But here's our version, trying to emulate that same band, trying to use the techniques we've figured out to copy them. On to 78. We got pretty close. We learned some lessons along the way, but we were pretty happy with it. What I also liked was that I brought literally the best practitioners of traditional jazz from around the world and made them do that. Here we go. Here's a record for St. Louis, January 1924. This is the 10-piece band. The tune's called R.R. Archie. Okay, here's our version. I was pretty happy with this one. So there you go. That's a really fun way that we study this old music. Okay. Here we go. Okay. We live in an amazing time. And the first thing I mentioned is that you can see what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the internet and how it's incredible the resources we have with new technology now. One thing I use all the time is the Templeton collection. We have access to sheet music that you could only get in the past from seasoned collectors. And now we can have access to rare sheet music just by clicking on websites like the one that is provided by this great institution. We have technology available free online that can slow down a 78 recording. I can listen to that record, ba, 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 and I can be writing down notes at a speed I can handle. We can share information with each other from across the seas. This is my old teacher. He lives in Edinburgh, Scotland, in a tiny little house. I still go on his videos to try and figure out how to play certain exercises from old method books correctly. Michael McQuaid, he's got a great series called Overthinking Old Jazz, where he gets into deep topics that you couldn't find anybody in your locality to talk with us about, but online you can. You can learn how to play Nick Lucas material from guys like Nick Rossi. Or you can go on my YouTube channel and be bored to tears like you are now. This represents AI. I'm not quite sure what AI is, but I think it's something like this. No, AI is already posing interesting questions about the future for this music. One is, how can we use AI to understand old records better? If a record is so badly worn out that we can barely hear it, maybe AI can fix the transfer for us by teaching you how to identify where the surface noise is and where the music is. Something that AI is already being used for in our pursuit of understanding old music is in translating lyrics. There are blues records from rural blues musicians and folk musicians that are really hard to pick out. People don't talk like that anymore, but AI can figure it out. So we can learn lyrics and songs from old records already using AI. So we have no idea what the future holds. Personally, on a regular basis, I study old videos on YouTube, which, again, you would have had to go to a collector. Now I can think, well, how did Johnny St. Cyr play the six-string banjo? I can click on a video, and I can see him playing at Disneyland. If this doesn't know, just skip it. Well, you get the idea. Then, oh, here we go. You can see exactly what his fingers are doing. It's incredible. And so when playing this old music, oops, sorry Eddie Lang, no, none of that. Okay, oh, I see what I'm doing wrong. As Eddie Peabody. Here we go, okay. You see what I mean? We use every single tool at our disposal. Now we're getting into the question of why, and this is just 2 slides, so I think I have time. so why do we do it? Why do we do it to this degree? Why don't we just play generic? Why don't we just smooth it all over and just do it as one type of music? I believe that there's value in these differences. As we move into the future, culture in general is becoming more homogenized, and so is music. And today, if you travel from one town to another, from one country to another, you may not even notice any difference in the local band's music that you're playing. A local rock band from one town is trying to sound like Metallica, and they're trying to sound like Metallica elsewhere. But there's always going to be people preserving regional styles of music. And that's what's so interesting about early American styles of music, is that regional identity plays into these styles so much. And firstly, why is it important? Because it's entertaining, it's fun, it's enriching. It's enriching to go to New Orleans and hear real New Orleans jazz like you can't hear anywhere else. To go to France or Belgium and hear gypsy jazz played in the way that only the French and Belgian have learned to do, by using the exact same techniques that we use with American ragtime and early jazz. To go to Memphis and hear blues the way they play it there. These cities and communities need people upholding these styles to keep the world a varied and rich and beautiful place. But also, without roots and identity, I feel like people become disenfranchised, and they lose touch with their community. They lose touch with their surroundings and where they're from. And so, in St. Louis, I try to get people to care about their historic St. Louis music, because I want them to be proud of where they're from, and to love it and look after it. And if we don't do that, then we lose our cultural currency. And that's how you get once amazing towns and communities being bought up and turned into strip malls, because people have lost sight of what matters about those communities and what they should be proud of. If you look at New Orleans, a town that has a Nashville, it also is great for the economy, having a unique selling point. And America, almost everywhere you go, has its own unique music. You can see, just in this page alone, West Coast jazz, New Orleans jazz, Texas Western swing, New York big band jazz. Wouldn't it be amazing if in 100 years' time we could still travel around the country and hear a different type of music everywhere we went? And that's what we do, that's what we're trying to uphold. And that's why we think it matters. So this seems like a non sequitur. And this is my last slide here. If anybody can figure out the connection, you win. So I've always been interested in all sorts of history. I was just reading some news articles, sometime last year. No, that's not how I found out. My godmother lives in France. And she told me about this place called Gilliam, Castle Gilliam. And it is a full medieval castle, but construction started in 1997. It was built by a team of archaeologists and architects fascinated by medieval history. And for fun, just because in the academic pursuit, they said, let's build a medieval castle exactly how it was built in the 13th or 14th century. But to the most authentic degree possible. They said, we'll quarry the stone using the tools they used to quarry the stone. We will use the local forest for trees using axes that we forge in our own forge. We will eat food hunted and foraged. They have a team of farmers and hunters in this community. They own all the land around it. And for years, you can see, here they are in 2019. It seems like a folly, doesn't it? It seems like history for fun. Really good fun, really interesting. But what? Why does it matter? Well, this is why it matters. Do you remember when this happened to Notre Dame, 2019? Notre Dame, we were all watching this happen, and we're thinking, oh my God, it's gone. It's gone. What does the world do now? It doesn't have Notre Dame. It's terribly sad. Well, nobody knew how to rebuild a medieval cathedral, except for a weird group of nerds who for 30, 24 years had been teaching themselves these techniques to rebuild it as closely and perfectly as possible for countless future generations. And that really struck a chord with me, because it made me think, what we do by putting our heads so far in the past and studying this music, which seems to have no place in the future, what we do is more about the future than it is about the past. Or at the very least, it's equally about the future as it is about the past. By learning about the building blocks of American, or as Dave was saying, really all of modern music, we are learning, well, we don't know what it's going to be used for and how important it will be. But we know it is, and we know it's worthwhile, because it's the foundation of our culture now. And we never know when that foundation might need replacing, or restructuring, or just strengthening. And so we do it because it matters, and we might not know how yet, but we will do when it does. I think that's all. I think that's my whole lecture. And if you want to sign up for my mailing list, I only send about 3 or 4 emails a day.
We have a little time for Q&A if anybody would like to discuss anything with TJ or bring up a question, and I'll start since I'm bringing that up. You talked about the stories you were learning from Bill Mason and Charlie Kreth's grandson.
Yes, yeah.
And how they're not available anywhere. Are you writing the story of St. Louis Jazz, or are you planning on it? Is it something that will eventually be made available to others?
One day, I will probably do something like that. And actually, it may come from my wife Maggie, who I'm very lucky. My wife Maggie is works for the St. Louis Historic Society, which is the Missouri Historical Society, and she's in the library there. And the two of us have talked about collaborating on a proper book. And actually, the first thing that we're interested in writing about is actually the generation of African American musicians prior to Scott Joplin, the African American St. Louis musicians who set the stage for Chestnut Valley. And so that's the first thing we're talking about. But at some point there will be a publication. First of all, I'm just gigs and gigs and gigs until pay up my car.
Because you don't want those stories to get lost. Once they're gone, you're in.
Absolutely, yeah, they will be documented. And one thing I haven't done, to my shame, is done a proper recorded interview with Bill. I've known him for 10 years now, but when you know somebody that's elderly, still plays, every time I gig, I just want to have fun with him, and I think, I don't want to, he feels embarrassed, and I just want to have fun, but it's gotten to a point, it's like, okay, but I've done 3,000 gigs of you. It's time for an interview. You know, so I think it's going to happen early this
Awesome.
year, I think. Any other questions?
I have a question. I enjoyed hearing your morphing of how you obtained the 100-year-old version to your version and make it as true as possible. So my question is, when you deal with that process, how do you do the percussion part? Is it the same process as the other instruments, or do you leave a little room for the Joshes to fill in that? So what's your approach to
Well,
that?
that's a really interesting question, and that actually brings up a separate point, because especially in the acoustic age, every instrument that's recorded isn't necessarily recorded in the way in which they would play in a live setting. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. Here we go. So here you see the percussionist. The percussionist playing with this small jazz ensemble. But what's that? That's not a drum set. That's a music stand with a tiny table and one cymbal and a woodblock. And a mallet also that he uses on the cymbal. That's not what he was playing when he was playing in person. So we have to ask ourselves, how is he recording differently to how he's playing? Now he's playing this way because bass drums and snare drums don't record well, really. They don't record as well on this technology as simply a woodblock and a cymbal. So we have to use other techniques to discern how the musicians were playing. Stock arrangements is one. We can read the drum parts, but we can also use old footage. We can watch how they're playing. Even if we can't hear it, we can watch it. We can use all the above techniques. Talk to older musicians. Hey, you saw Baby Dots playing in 1940 whatever. How did he do it? How did he sound? We can listen to New Orleans revival records. That's not even anything we got into today. You can listen to recordings of old musicians who were alive during the 20s, who are still playing in a similar way. And so that's what we do with the drum parts from the 20s. We take all of that information and make our best guess. And I think using all of that, we can get really, really close to how they were playing. And so that's how we do those drum parts. Okay. Well, I've had, oh, sorry.
Vintage instruments, you see melody
Yes,
tracks.
yes, vintage instruments are really important, and I try and use vintage instruments all the time. But this is the important thing: you have to use good vintage instruments, because modern people hate C melody saxophones because C melody saxes aren't used. They haven't been used in jazz really since they stopped being used in the 1930s, and there's still a lot of them around. But the ones that have survived in general are the cheapo student models. And in fact, in general, those are the instruments that you find the most of. So if you go out and try and stock your orchestra full of instruments designed for 11-year-olds to learn on, your instrument, they're not going to be good quality. They're not going to sound good. So you have to seek out quality vintage instruments. Matt Tolentino plays an artist model, gold-plated C melody sax, and it actually sounds nice. If you can imagine that nice sounding C melody, it's possible. And so that's what we do. We look for quality vintage instruments, or we find modern instruments that can sound as close as possible. Sometimes that's a better option.
And that's really a tradition as well, when you consider all the classical music is being performed by orchestras around the world with the instruments of the time the music had been written. And what does it sing? Martin in the Fields is one of the most famous examples. They're using those instruments that were the instruments, the music when it was current was being played on, of Mozart's era, Bach's.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So it's the same principle, really, just now used with a different genre.
Yeah, when we did the comb thing, we used a Hairmaster 2000 and, quality gold-plated comb. Well, folks, I enjoyed presenting this, and thanks for being here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you, everybody.